Alright, so I'm a child of history, and one thing I love more than normal history is what if history. Now, in the history of video gaming, there are a lot of these what ifs. So let's take a look at 5 of the biggest what ifs in video game history. My number 5 biggest what if in video game history is what if Black Isle Studios made Fallout 3? Now, this is one that probably isn't a huge what if, but it's still definitely one to take into consideration. Black Isle Studios was making a very different Fallout 3. It was it was going to be a bit different from Fallout 1 and 2, which were more CRPGs, kind of D&D-ish. But basically anything you did in their version of Fallout 3, which came to be known as Van Buren before it was canceled, was anything that you did was going to have a humongous impact on what happened in the game. Now, this obviously we know this game wasn't made since Fallout 3 was ended up being made by Bethesda and ended up being a first-person shooter RPG hybrid. But if Van Buren was made instead of Fallout 3 as we know it today, I definitely think that Fallout New Vegas obviously doesn't happen. Fallout 3 as we know it doesn't happen. Fallout 4 doesn't happen or as we know it today to be. Heck, Black Isle Studios ended up getting canned basically before this game came out. This might have ended up saving their asses if Van Buren had ended up being made. So we might have even more D&D style Fallout games, and Bethesda would just be pumping out more and more Elder Scrolls games, I suppose.
We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century.
Now this is one of my favorites. At number 4 we have, what if Sega didn't screw up the Sega Saturn? Now as you may know, the Sega Saturn ended up being surprise launched like a day or two after E3 back in, I think it was like 1995 or 96. And the Sega Saturn, which was a freaking powerhouse of a system, ended up freaking failing for it didn't even get much in the way of games before for like a year or so because people weren't developing games for it, and some freaking retailers didn't even carry the system because they were so pissed at Sega. This is definitely one of the landmark moments of gaming back in the 90s. This is essentially the beginning of the end of Sega. Sega was rolling along pretty well. They only had really one big failure in the 32X up to this point, but the Sega Saturn was a disaster. Yeah, it had good games, and it was a 2D wise, it could crush the freaking N64, but it didn't support 3D that well. It was a pain in the ass to develop for, and combine that with Sega screwing up the launch like no other. Basically, this signaled the end of Sega. Now, if Sega didn't screw this up, and the Sega Saturn ended up being a pretty decent success, I still like to think Sega's still around today making consoles. The Sega Dreamcast happened to just end up being ahead of its time. Well, if the Dreamcast gets pushed back a couple years, and that system could easily have taken on the GameCube and the Xbox and whatnot, but I still, if the Sega Saturn and the see, this happens because if the Sega Saturn is a success, I solidly believe the Sega Dreamcast would have been a success just because it happened to be ahead of its time. I do definitely believe Sega is still around making consoles if the Sega Saturn ends up doing well and basically setting the pace for Sega to come into the 20th century.
The 21st century.
Well, 21st century, that is. Now, this next one is the definition of a massive what if, and is arguably the biggest what if on this list. What if MS hadn't bought Rare from Nintendo? Now, Rare, as you may know, in the early 2000s, was definitely still pumping out good games, even though they weren't quite to the quality of the late 90s Rare. But they were still putting out very good games, and apparently they were developing Banjo-Kazooie 3 well before they got bought by MS. Now, MS has definitely been bashed big time for screwing this deal up, and I definitely believe they did. They essentially bought Rare and had them not make Rare games. They made weird games. They didn't make Banjo-Kazooie 3 for some reason, even though it was in development when MS bought them. But this scale of this what if is absolutely amazing because this could have get the GameCube freaking humongous. And the GameCube was a bit of an underwhelming system to a lot of people, but if Banjo-Kazooie 3 and Rare's other games come out for the GameCube, holy crap, that could have been insane. And then imagine motion controlled Banjo-Kazooie and whatnot like that for the Nintendo Wii. And then for the Wii U, we still might have gotten even more Rare games from, or that might have ended up saving the Wii U from having little to no games. The Rare being bought by Microsoft definitely is one of the biggest what ifs ever. If Nintendo keeps Rare on their side and gets them still pumping out great games over the course of the GameCube, Wii, and Wii U's lifespan, that could really have changed the dynamics of the past few console generations. Now this right here is a big what if. What if Nintendo didn't screw over Sony back when they were making the hybrid console, CD console for the Super NES? Now, for those who don't necessarily know this, Nintendo and Sony originally were partners, and Sony had a contract with Nintendo to make a CD-based add-on for the Super NES. Well, a day after this partnership really got all of its attention back at E3 I think it was like 94 or 95. Well, Nintendo ended up screwing over Sony the very next day after they announced their partnership and whatnot. Nintendo ended up going with Philips and one of the biggest travesties ever. And Sony, getting pissed at Nintendo, ended up making the PlayStation. Nintendo is directly responsible for arguably their biggest competitor in gaming. Now, if Sony makes this add-on for the Super NES, and Sony doesn't make the PlayStation, where are we today in that world? It's really hard to even take in the scale of this because it's massive. Essentially, we would have Nintendo versus probably Sega and Xbox, because the Dreamcast was killed by the PS2, which obviously spawned from the PS1, which spawned from the entire travesty with Nintendo and Sony. Nintendo would have had their add-on for the Super NES and probably would have even had something for the N64. So that could have been even more dynamic. So this is a very big what if, because you have an entire console in this 3-horse race taken out of the equation, and who knows even if we have a PlayStation today. I would highly doubt it, but in the end, it's really hard to say. We might have a PlayStation today, but it's not nearly as good as the Nintendo or the Xbox. Or maybe Sony would have just said, "Screw it, we'll get in this anyway," and go even bigger. So, or maybe Sony wouldn't have even gotten in the console race like Philips after the freaking CDI was a total disaster. But we've saved the biggest for the last. And I'm sure everybody probably knows what's coming, but it really is the biggest what if in gaming history. What if Atari didn't crash the industry back in the 80s? Now, this is obviously the biggest what if, and it's enormous in scale, so trying to put it into perspective is damn near impossible, but we're going to try. If Atari, let's say, had their seal, if they had a seal of quality like what Nintendo had back in the 80s, it is entirely possible that the industry doesn't crash and Atari just keeps chugging along with an insane market share of something like 80%. And it's insane to even think about that. I mean, one company having that much power over an entire industry is really insane. And in reality, they might not even exist today still because they might have gotten an antitrust suit against them simply for having a monopoly on the industry. But hell, maybe Nintendo still gets in the race anyway and takes down Atari because Super Mario Brothers. I mean, it's hard to say how this would have even turned out. Maybe we're playing the Atari 50,700,064 today instead of the Xbox One, PS4, and the Wii U. One company having so much power, and if they hadn't screwed up so royally bad, it essentially the industry, there's no way it would be anywhere near the same as it is today. But hell, it's a what if. It didn't happen, so who the hell knows? But let me know what you guys think might have happened in the comments below. Thanks for watching.